To Insights and Innovations in Cybersecurity, what every MSP needs to know. I'm your host, Michelle Young, and I thank you for joining us today. Before we get started with our superstar panelists, I would like to encourage you to participate in the discussion. The Q&A chat will be open throughout the webinar, so please type your questions at any time. You can also upvote questions you like by clicking on the thumbs up icon. We will answer your questions live, so don't be shy. Now, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our panelists. Mike Lotus, the Chief Security Officer for Arete Incident Response, and Dave Baggett, the CEO and founder of Inky. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks for hosting. Great to be here.
Hi, it is great to be here. Thank you.
Mike, I just read in a recent survey that I saw that security issues are now the top of the list of MSP challenges. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree in a sense. I really like to think of it in terms of risk mitigation as the key challenge to MSPs, and both from an internal perspective as well as for their clients. And one of the examples that I like to use is back in the day, and back in the day now, it's, in cyber terms, we're talking 3-4 years ago. Sodina Kibi was a new kid on the block for ransomware. And one of the methods they were using to gain access to their victims was actually compromising the victims' MSPs. And it was one-stop shopping. And so they would hack into an MSP and suddenly they'd have access to 50 different victims, or 100 or 500 or 1,000 different victims. And they're using the administrative tools of that MSP to gain access and do their nefarious work. And so I think from a perspective of security issues, yes, but I really think it's more in terms of risk mitigation and people, process, and technology. And as we go through and we get more into it, we'll see where that comes into play. But the risk mitigation aspect is really going to be key throughout. So security is one thing, but when people think of security, they're really thinking cybersecurity technology. And I think it's a broader issue than that for MSPs.
Got it. And you mentioned ransomware. I guess that usually comes in via email, which at Inky is our bread and butter. What are the other vectors that you see most commonly abused? I mean, how are the attackers getting in, or they're trying to get in most frequently?
I think you hit the nail on the head there. Phishing right now is still the #1 vector that we see. And that's part of the kind of pattern that you'll see throughout history. They hack the technology, then the technology comes and they're a little bit ahead. And so now they're hacking the people, and then the people get better and something like Inky comes in and protects, and then they go back to hacking the technology again. And then it's just a cyclical pattern for the different vectors. But I think in addition to that, you're going to see less common now, but we're still seeing some 0-day hack intrusions. And so you're seeing things like Log4j, which was in the news recently.
Yep.
And that was a global pandemic. There's lots of things that hit like that. Often they're caught and patched very quickly and quietly, but we're still seeing those being leveraged. We're also seeing a lot, not a lot, but a fair bit of brute force. And so if clients aren't using good hygiene, so for example, if they have RDP or terminal servers on the internet, they're not using MFA, or it's not behind a VPN, and brute forcing access into those systems is also fairly common as well. And so there's a number of different things that folks are using. We're still actually seeing some physical access, like kiosks, things like that. 15 years ago, the Wi-Fi drive-bys was a big thing. It's less common now. We still see it every once in a while, but I think the hygiene there with WPA3, et cetera, has really gotten better. Email is by far and away the most common.
Yeah, and you mentioned MFA, the multi-factor authentication.
Yeah.
We see that in email too, because we'll see someone who is a third party, like a vendor of a customer, their account will get hacked because they don't have multi-factor authentication and their password's weak. And then we'll see mail coming from this third party, and it's from their real account. It's an account takeover. But of course, it's not that person who's writing the email, it's the attacker, right?
100%. And we actually categorize that slightly differently in terms of it could be a vector for ransomware and pushing malware. Often we call it a business email compromise.
Right.
And it's more in line with, that third party vendor is sending a new invoice and saying, hey, by the way, our account's changed, so please send payment for this invoice to this new account, and it's coming from accounts payable at that vendor. But it's really not. It's actually the threat actor. And
there may not be a malicious link in that mail, because it's just literally could be just an attachment. Please pay this, right?
Right. There's no malicious link. The maliciousness in that email is actually the new account number. And so very difficult to detect those and flag those. Less common, you'll see where they're using an email address and they're spoofing it. And so they may put a 1 instead of an I, or something along those lines, or an I instead of a 1. That's less common. It's still fairly common now. But the compromise O365 or even Exchange and sending an email, that's very, very common right now. A lot of financial institutions and even major companies are being hit with that.
And I guess from the attacker's perspective, it's cheap. They just have to send a bunch of emails, right?
Yeah. I mean, getting the initial compromise may take a little bit of work, but once they're in there, it's very cheap. And personally, I think it's actually a little higher risk because they still have to get the money somehow. I mean, it has to go to an account somewhere. And so they have the FBI and law enforcement has had some luck in clawing some of that funding back if they can get to it fast enough. But if it's outside of like a 24 to 48-hour window, it's usually gone. They'll bounce it between banks and you can't get the money back. But if it's still within, a 12-hour window, you can often get it back.
Interesting. And one thing I always wonder is, I read, of course, we all do, about security incidents in the mainstream press.
Yeah.
How much of that accords with your own experience? And one thing I always wonder, not being an MSP, I assume you get some new customers because they come to you in some sort of panic, something bad happened to them. But I could easily imagine a lot of times it's not just security. It's like, we didn't do backups and lost all of our documents. Is security usually the catalyst for someone coming to you and saying, I really need help? Or is it all across the board?
It can be across the board. Generally for us, our core business, we've got MSP, we've got MDR. Our core funnel is from the IR perspective. So the bulk of our new clients come in through a security.
Got it.
But I have a call next week with a SLED client, and they've got other SLED clients. And so we're actually looking at MSP services, not for one SLED, major school district, but actually an entire region of school districts. And those generally on the proactive side, it could be something driven by backups. It could be that they have a compliance or regulatory, hey, we need a pen test. We just don't understand what we have. Can you guys come in and give us an assessment? Or they're reading in the news about ransomware. And they're like, well, how do we actually respond if there's a ransomware? And so we do things with them from an education standpoint, if it's a tabletop, or we also do assessments where we look at their incident response planning and help tune and tweak that. And if we're not the MSP, we're working with the MSP because they're a critical portion of that. The MSP are the people providing the services. And backups are that is I actually think, to your first question, security issues, I almost think when you think of the old CISSP, confidentiality, integrity, availability, at the end of the day, it's all about the data. And I think the CIA of the data is really the big issue. And we get a lot of work because of that. People are just very concerned about, is our data confidential? Has it been modified? And can we get access to it? Do we have
Can we get it
backup?
back?
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Is it going to be available for us at some point? And so the data hygiene and the use case modeling that they use for their data and their backups is just critical. I can't tell you how many big clients, small clients we have that, oh, we've got backups and they're non-functional. We had one client that was backing everything up to the cloud, which was great. Until they tried to do a recovery and they realized it was going to take them like 3.5 years to download all the data they had up in the cloud. I mean, literally, it would have been faster to recreate some of the data from what they had than it would be to download all their data. It was,
Wow.
yeah, we had to pull some magic and actually work with the cloud provider. It was a major cloud provider. Work with them to basically do one of their data centers in a can, migrate the data there, and then pull it down physically, and then do it that way.
Send it to them in a truck. Here's your truck of disks.
They literally did. They loaded a truck up with, bunch of storage arrays, drove it in, plugged it in. It was a mess.
So you mentioned SLED, and I think most people know that's state local education.
Yeah.
And I feel like, just from what I read, they're heavily targeted, and I think a cyber attacker views them as a fairly soft target. Is that true? I mean, I also wonder, are the small businesses the ones that are most vulnerable to this stuff, or is it really a misconception to believe anybody is more or less safe from these bad guys?
It's funny. I think because of a variety of different reasons, almost everyone's equally vulnerable. You have the larger companies, which are much more mature, robust, they've got better security. They're also a larger target. And so you may have a focused effort to get in. I actually worked with a very, very large Fortune 100 firm, and they brought us in because we have an issue. And when we started digging into it, they didn't have a issue. They had 3 separate nation states fighting a cyber war in their environment. And they were patching and they were hacking and they were kicking each other out and maintaining persistence. You're not going to see that in a small enterprise, but the level of effort that those 3 nation states were using for this major company was impressive. The small ones, I think they're vulnerable from an immaturity level. And also it's the engineering by Google, which is really what gets them. They're small, they don't know better. They Google, hey, I need something, and then they spend what little money they have on it. And a lot of times what I tell clients, don't go spend money on technology right now. And don't kill me for saying that, but don't spend the money for technology now. Get an MSP or get someone who knows what they're doing to come in and do an assessment on what you have, how you're using it, and then come up with a long-term roadmap and strategy for what technology you need. And small companies, medium companies, large companies, all of them should do that, I think. And all of them are falling prey to, we're just going to go buy. And then the implementation is where they get killed.
Yep. I want to get to the state actor question in a moment, but first I'm curious, we play this cat and mouse game with attackers. I mean, we look at what fish are coming in, and we look at, we study malicious emails to see what their new stuff is. And I often joke there's some Walter White type figure out there who's developing these phishing kits based on new tactics, and he's really, really smart. And then it's weaponizing a bunch of stuff. And then you've got script kiddies who are, using all this. You feel like you're in a constant battle of white hat versus black hat?
That is my life. Yes, I feel like it never stops. They used to say, and I think they still do, we have to be right 1,000 times out of 1,000 times. They only have to be right once. So if we're only right 999 times and we're wrong once and they're right once, out of that, they win. And I really, and you've seen it, and I'm sure you see it as well as you're doing your research into the next gen and just this continually evolving threat. They're out there and there's dedicated groups and all they do are compromises and or do research into security tools and practices and enterprises, like outward facing enterprises. It's always evolving. It never stops. So we've had tools that a snapshot in time, and I always tell people the snapshot in time, this is the best solution set right now. 4 weeks from now, it may be completely vulnerable to log4j or whatever.
Right. Good example.
But right now, this is the stack. But it's a continuous evaluation. And so one of the things that we as a partner with the clients and partner with other vendors, we look for is someone who's doing that. We're always improving the product. We're always doing research, next gen, because it is a battle. And it can't just be the MSPs or the security providers. It's got to be the partners and the technology vendors in that battle with us. Because
yeah,
we can't win them all. And so we've got to have some support and help from all of the partners together so that we can battle this together.
One of the things I saw early on, I mean, we've been doing phishing protection for 5-6 years now. One of the things I saw early on, and it's kind of a ridiculous epiphany in retrospect, but we saw these mails go out that were like impersonating USAA or some insurance company.
Yeah.
And, my wife asked me, how do they know we have USAA? And I'm like, they don't have to. They just have to know somebody has USAA.
Exactly.
So your point about they only have to be right once.
Yeah.
They actually do this very intentionally and send everyone a USAA fake mail, and the ones who have USAA will get more likely to get snared by them, right?
100%. I'm getting, and I'm sure you may be as well, they're going to text messages now also. And so I'm getting just inundated with text messages from banks that I don't have accounts at, wanting me to click on a link because I need to approve a large transfer to Robert. And Robert's waiting for his money. Please go click here. Yeah, I don't even have an account there. They don't care if I have an account there. All they know is that there's someone at the other end of that number. And if they hit enough of them, they'll have a subset of people who do have an account there. And of that group, they'll have a smaller group, and they only need, like 0.1% to actually make money, whatever their figure is. So it doesn't matter. They'll send 1 million texts out. And if they get 1,000 people,
they win.
who actually do it, they win. If they get 100, they win. Doesn't cost anything to send text now. It's like, do you remember Usenet back in the day?
Oh yeah, I'm old enough.
And if are you sure you want to send this message because it's going to go globally and will cost tens of thousands of dollars and millions of people to read it? Yeah. Yeah, that hasn't changed. They still do
so
that.
much for that. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Now, this may be a sensitive topic, but you talked about state actors, and I saw, you've got at least 2 decades of experience working in federal government and large industry. Are there, if you can talk about it, any well-known cybersecurity breaches that we've all heard about that something interesting about that you can share that most people don't know? Obviously, can't tell us anything secret, but I'm just curious because, those of us who are not in a SOC or a leadership position in security at a multinational bank or at a federal agency, we imagine that the state actors are massively more capable and scary. And is that true? I mean, and what does it look like to be inside one of these attacked entities?
It's actually interesting. They do have capabilities that the ransomware script kiddies folks just don't. I have seen them do some stuff that is so next gen. We just kind of sat and watched them like, I can't believe they're doing this. I mean, on the lower end of that, we had a threat actor who was compiling or decompiling his code, pushing it through an SQL server just with SQL commands, recompiling it on the host system and running the software there. Didn't even bother with persistence or anything else. They did everything to compromise the entire internal network through SQL commands.
Wow.
The level of expertise it takes to be that good with SQL, and it was manual. I mean, we got to the point we were keystroke logging. It was manual. The skill set there is insane. What you're seeing with, like, they're classically trained, they've been working, doing compromises in very, very tightly coupled groups. So like, this is your SQL group, this is your firewall group, this is your Active Directory group, and they even break it into smaller subsets. And they're experts in their field. I mean, they are SMEs. Very difficult to go head to head with them in their area of expertise. You have to be able to take a step back and really look at holistically how you can get them out. It's very hard to root them out. Compare and contrast that with the ransomware folks. There are groups that specialize in gaining access. Some of them are former nation state and they're very, very good. And then they gain access and sell that to the ransomware. So when you see all the ransomware out there, it doesn't necessarily mean those ransomware folks are gaining access. There's other access brokers out there that could be gaining the access, and some of them are extremely skilled. We've actually gotten reports from the threat actors that were better written than most penetration test reports that you'll see stateside. Perfect English,
Wow.
network diagrams. It's insane. But kind of one of the funny things we had, just from an MSP management standpoint, we had I still can't believe they did this. We had another threat actor that came into a very large financial institution, very large. I mean, you would have seen it in the news. It was a big one. They came in, got access, they set a lab up in the environment so they could test their code. And so they went through a formal test QA process in the client's environment for their code. Then they were patching and upgrading the client's environment to like newer generations of libraries, etc. Like they updated Java so that their code would run and optimize it.
Wait, so you're saying they had a development test and QA environment that they set up in the victim's infrastructure?
Yeah. And then they were optimizing the victim's infrastructure and tuning it. So they actually improved the efficiency of the victim's infrastructure and made
silver lining.
Made it run better so that
wow.
they could actually operate in a more effective manner and get more data. And so the client was having issues, and then their issues started to go away, and they're like, yeah, the network's it's never run this well in the last few years. It's just working.
Something good happened. Oh my God.
And you know, they also blinded, like they wanted their test QA, so they logged into the route. They owned the entire thing, logged into the core switches and pulled their segments out of the VLANs for the span ports for monitoring. So they completely managed the entire infrastructure as if they were an MSP, and that was one of the access groups. And it was,
you can imagine one of these attackers being like, hey, we use source code control, we're not barbarians.
yeah, you know, they're checking stuff in and out. I mean, yeah, it was, when you get in there and you see some of the stuff from the more sophisticated folks, like the older school, where it's not just a smash and grab, some of the stuff they were doing, it was almost funny. I mean,
that's really, you know, they talk about persistent, advanced persistent threats. I mean, that is persistent. Yeah. They set up a whole QA environment in your infrastructure. That's the definition of persistent.
Yeah, no, they were in there for like almost 2 years.
So how do you know who these people are? I mean, you said you were at a case where it was multiple state actors, and you know, one of the things that I always wonder, not having been in that sort of environment. I mean, we see attackers all the time, but they generally come from US IPs, even if they're foreign. We don't know
Yeah.
where they're from. How do you reliably trace back, like, oh, that was North Korea, or you know, how do you know in the modern era where it's just everything's virtualized?
You never know 100%, but there's
Hmm.
enough TTPs and things they do, and we can do code analysis. So it's getting a little more munged now, but it was easier before where people had discrete tool sets and they were writing their own code.
Ah, yeah.
And so we could do things like cluster hashing on the code or doing some RE on the code and then provide attribution on the code. We would also be able to do things like, you know, tracing back and looking for kind of techniques, known malicious IPs that that threat actor has used in the past, things like that. If you can trace it back far enough, you know, it's not one single thing, it's a number of different things. The other piece of that is we often work with law enforcement and or other government agencies and do coordination with them. And so as we're providing our findings, what we're seeing, they're giving us snippets as well. And
I guess you guys let them mess around for a while so you can observe their behavior, or is it kind of like, no, get them out immediately? Or is that sort of a topic of debate?
you know, there was a time when that was almost accepted, was to, because they really wanted to figure out what it was or who they were, we were laying traps for them almost. And it was this whole big thing where we didn't want them to maintain persistence. So we'd figure out where they were. We would set up an expulsion event and then shut everything down, do all the mitigation at once and bring it back up. And that was, you know, a long time ago. I mean, more than a decade ago. But as you know, times have progressed, the technology's gotten better. So the endpoint security's gotten better. We've gotten other tools that we can use, which enable us to fight through. And so unless there's a law enforcement directive like, hey, hold on, we really want these guys for XYZ reason, we can pretty rapidly remove a threat actor from an environment.
Yeah, because I just remember reading, and this is probably the 80s, the Cliff Stoll's book, The Cuckoo's Egg, and it was basically this, he spent a whole year tracking these attackers down.
Yeah.
And it's a great, and it makes for a great
read that.
story, but you know, it's like, how much do you really want them to be in your system to learn about them versus just kicking them out immediately?
Yeah.
And I guess
it's
your point
often
is,
hard.
with law enforcement, they might have a reason they want to leave them in there for a while, but usually not, it sounds like.
And it's easier to kick them out immediately if it's like, we only have a couple thousand systems and 2 data centers. When you go multinational and you start
Yeah.
getting to large environments, you know, 50, 100,000 plus, it becomes a little more complicated to figure out where the persistence is. And so, you know, sometimes they're still in there, but not by choice. It just takes some time to root them out. And
I could talk about this. I could talk about this stuff all day, but I want to make sure we cover some useful stuff for, let's say I'm just a stressed out, non-technical CEO.
Yeah.
And I think all this stuff is buzzwords. I don't know what, you know, I hear about ransomware. I kind of know what that is. You know, what would you tell me to do? I mean, so I'm reading about all this stuff constantly. I'm terrified that my company's on the line and I don't even know what this stuff is. Like, where do I start?
You know, I've actually talked to a slew of clients over the last couple of months about just that. Like, I don't even understand what this stuff is. And I think that's actually a failing of us. And by us, I mean everyone in the security industry. I think a lot of us, you know, from the services side, vendor side, have kind of been chasing that Gartner upper right-hand quadrant and going for niches. Like, oh, we've got to be in this niche and that. And I was at RSA a couple months ago, and everyone was talking about zero trust, but none of the presentations were the same. I saw like 10 different presentations for zero trust. All of them were completely different. And so for a non-technical CEO, I think that's really where it comes into you're going to start panicking because there's no single source of truth. And so what I tell them is find yourself a trusted advisor. You know, it could be a big four if you're dealing with the big four. Usually I would recommend like an MSP or an MDR firm or someone, and just have them come in and run an assessment with you just to help you understand what do you actually have? And more importantly, how are you using your IT infrastructure? And once you get to that point where you know what you have, how you're actually using it, and what the requirements are for future use, then start talking capabilities. Don't fall into the engineering through Google phase yet. Start talking capabilities. Right? Like, you know, you're using email, you're gonna need email security. I mean, that's a given. But the capability is, you don't care about the solution set yet. What's the capability? We need email security. You know, you're gonna have remote access. You need some sort of solution there. You know, you're gonna be authenticating through remote access. You need something to harden that. Then you can get into, well, we need a VPN and we need MFA. But get that trusted advisor to give you the capabilities first, and then get the technology and the solution sets in place together so they all mesh, and you can get down to as close to a single pane of glass as you can for management, alerts, events, all of that. I was actually at a very, very large, once again, Fortune 100 company, and went in, and the CIO was like, I hate you. You're a vendor. You're going to sell me something. I don't want to talk to
you. Tell me what you really think.
Right. And I was like, okay, and walked away. And a couple of days later, he was in there, you're trying to sell me something. I'm like, no, I'm just here fixing this other thing. You're good. A week and a half later, I get a call to leave lunch early, go back, and he's waiting in the office. And he's like, all right, I can't take it anymore. Give me the pitch. And I didn't have a pitch. What I did is whiteboard with him for 45 minutes about what he had, how he was using it, and what capabilities. And then I said, look, we bought a company, Fidelis Cybersecurity. So I was working with them at the time. This is what Fidelis could do, plus these other capabilities you need. Here's what our competition can do, plus these other capabilities, or you can roll it using open source. I don't really care, but we're talking capabilities here. He wound up buying a whole lot of gear, but it wasn't because I sold him on our technology. It's because I sold him as a trusted advisor. Here's the capability you need. And I think that's really where, you know, the panic CEO needs to get to. You know, it's not about how much budget you have necessarily. It's about what do you actually need, and getting someone to do that translation for you from the buzzword bingo into actual capabilities, and then an integrated solution set.
Yeah, and it seems like, you know, a key point there is something that we talk about too. We're, as a software vendor, as an MSP, also building trust in a non-sales mode is incredibly important. An example from our world is, you know, we do email security, and we'll have people say, I'm worried about my employees' accounts getting taken over, because does your thing prevent that? And we'll say, yes, but the first thing you should do is implement multi-factor authentication.
Exactly.
Make it not possible rather than use us to detect it after the fact. Now, if you're worried about third parties, you can't make everyone in the world do multi-factor authentication. That's where we can really help, because we can detect, hey, I don't think that's really Sally. She doesn't normally write an email like that. I wouldn't pay that invoice. But your own accounts, make them not possible to breach because you implement multi-factor authentication. So same kind of thing. And I think sometimes people are like, wait, but you're not trying to sell me your solution? Well, yes and no. Our solution is not the best way to prevent your own accounts from getting taken over. MFA is the best answer for that.
Right.
So yeah, and that's, you know, the kind of thing where we like working with MSPs also, because they tend to have more sophisticated view of this stuff, and therefore their customers also not only trust them, but also I think have a more sophisticated view of what they're trying to solve. Like, what problem are you trying to solve?
Yeah.
You know. So maybe it's a good time to take questions, Michelle. I think it was a great discussion, a lot of topics that we brought up. And I know we've probably got about 10 minutes left. So let's see if we got questions from the larger audience that we could cover.
Definitely. Really interesting conversations, Mike and Dave. And here is the first question from the audience. Mike, can you please speak on the Uber hack? Sort of a multi-level question here. How was the MFA breached?
I don't know. The Uber hack is not one that I've worked, and I get buried in with my stuff. So I'm not 100% up on the Uber hack. I'm not sure. I know how MFA has been breached on other engagements, but Uber in particular, I can't speak to that. And partly I can't speak to cases that other folks have worked on, or I may have inside stuff as well. But
understood. And from an MFA standpoint, what are some possibilities for MFA to get breached?
There's a number of ways that folks are bypassing MFA. I mean, one of the things that we've seen, it's not even really bypassing MFA per se. It's getting persistence on a user's workstation. They use MFA and then they're punching right through behind them. Or the old RSA tokens, you can get the keys. I've seen MFA used where you get the temporary passcodes and users store those on their workstations. The threat actors get access to the workstations. They see the temporary passcodes. They cut and paste those in, and they're bypassing MFA with the one-time passcodes. And sometimes when you set up MFA for a particular environment, you may get 5 of those. And so that's 5 tries for them to get in, set up another account, or do whatever they need to do.
One thing I've read is you can pay somebody at the phone company who's a rogue employee to clone a SIM card. So the MFA that's done via SMS, I know that's more vulnerable than using an authenticator app on your phone. I don't know what happened in the case of Uber, but
right. Yeah, the SMS side of things it's bad. Authenticator apps are a much better way to go.
Great. Thank you. Another question to the audience. Dave, this one to you. How does Inky protect users from phishing attacks?
Yeah, I mean, it's a combination of things. It's not an easy question to answer, but I'll try to give the 30-second answer instead of the 10-hour answer. So we think of phishing as generally coming in the form of some kind of impersonation. So it's either the attacker's pretending to be a brand that the most common one being Microsoft, but we cover hundreds of brands now, or they're pretending to be a person like the case we mentioned earlier with the BEC. Someone either gets access to your vendor's account or is just pretending to be them. So it's all about impersonation, and we use a variety of techniques to essentially detect forgery or impersonation. I like to say from first principles, meaning Inky doesn't have to have seen this mail before to know, hey, that's probably not really who it appears to be from. It's probably not really Microsoft, because we can use things like DKIM to check and prove, well, if it's from Microsoft, it should be coming from one of these 250 mail servers, and it's not. Or in the case of people, we can say, well, that really doesn't look like something Sally would write. It's not the kind of language she uses. It's not her greeting or closing. So we have ways to sort of ferret out this idea that it's impersonation of a brand or a person. There's edge cases like, the Bitcoin extortion scam that's not really impersonation, but most phishing for us is about detecting impersonation or forgery.
Yeah. So like anomalous detection, whether it's user behavior detection or programmatic detection, like on the endpoint. That's really
and one of the scary things that I realized early into my almost the last decade of working on phishing personally is, if I'm a bad guy and I want you to think I'm Microsoft, all I have to do is take a mail I got from Microsoft and change one thing and resend that to you. I don't even have to do any work to make it look perfectly like Microsoft. I can just use their real mail. And that's kind of where we realized, this is going to require a lot more sophisticated techniques than we'd been using to just detect spam.
Yep.
Wonderful. Mike, another question for you. If you can whittle it down to maybe the top 3, or in your opinion, the top three? If there's a few more, that's okay. The top three factors that are looked at when evaluating next gen versus legacy security solutions.
Yeah, so I think I'm reading that in there. Email phishing is number one vector of threats, what data your customers want to receive and that you want to provide about email protection. So one of the things we like to do with clients is we're looking at, email, we're looking at endpoint. We work with one of the major endpoint providers, and we like the baseline activity across the enterprise. And then we're looking for deltas. So if there's an uptick in phishing attacks, if there's an uptick in late logins for a user, if there's an uptick in administrator accounts using non-standard software, like they're doing network scans. So anything out of the baseline is really what our clients want to see. And we try to pull that together in a comprehensive report. One of the other things we like doing is we have clients in virtually every vertical. And so we try to break down threat trends per vertical, because you'll often see the threat actors will do phishing campaigns in a vertical, and then they'll do it in another vertical. So SLED was targeted heavily, and then financial institutions, and then healthcare is being targeted, and then they're back to SLED again. And so some of that is early warning on what we get in terms of they're starting this now. We need to really ramp up monitoring of phishing emails, administrative account access, things like that. So we try to blend or fuse real world threat intelligence with deltas from their baseline and provide customized tiered reports for the clients in terms of nothing's changed in your environment that we're seeing with elevated account activity, new accounts creation, phishing attack, and then your software profile. And then on the threat intelligence side, we're not seeing any new attacks in your vertical. You guys are doing okay. However, based on what we know about your environment, here's some patches for software that we know you have that you might want to implement. And so we try to monitor holistically the people, process, and technology. So your people are probably going to be okay here. Your process is still solid based on the known threat vectors and TTPs for this vertical that we're seeing. And then the technology may want to put some patches in.
Great. So there are a lot of really hard data points that they can actually refer to.
Yeah.
Dave, similarly, on your end, on the Inky side, what
Mhm.
sort of data points can a customer expect from a proof of value or a proof of concept with Inky?
Yeah, I mean, the good news for us is the legacy systems are letting a lot of fish through. So when we do a 2 or 4 week proof of value, proof of concept, we'll almost always find smoking gun fish in the first few days. And what we typically do is at the end of that 2 or 4 week period, we'll do a presentation that says, here's, a dozen fish that we caught. And it usually targets people in their company. And they're like, hey, look, Sally in finance just got this really nasty fish. And the other thing we tend to do is explain, well, this is why it got through. It's using this cloaking technique that the Walter White figure we mentioned earlier, smart enough to know will get through Proofpoint or Mimecast or the sort of ubiquitous incumbent systems. And we'll sort of explain this is why it got through them and this is why we detected it. And, that tends to give people a lot of insight in what we do without us having to sort of babble on about AI and have people roll their eyes because everyone says they have AI. It gives us a way to really kind of have the conversation that gives people the intuition of like, this is what we're doing that's different and why we can catch stuff that's getting through these other upstream systems.
Mm-hmm.
And we may also even tie in things like one of the vectors we see often is the threat actors stand up a new domain.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a clean domain, good reputation. And then they burn that domain in 12 hours with a campaign. And there's a number of tools like Inky that will say, hey, wait a minute, this is a brand new domain. it has a good reputation because it's not used, but it's not used. So we're still going to flag this as something that could be suspicious because it's a brand new domain.
And it's Microsoft-login.com.
Right, exactly. And so things like that, when you're tying your tool set and your metrics to the TTPs of the threat actors, I think is a value add as well. You're saying, hey, look, these are the guys that are targeting you. Here's their TTPs. Here's how we're detecting those TTPs and what we're doing to resolve that. We're at the 99% here. Now we need to do some training and other stuff.
Right. So, Mike, another question to you: an organization like Arete, how do you utilize Inky to provide that value to your customers in that ransomware affected space?
So for ransomware, it's almost after the fact, because when we're in the middle of battling the ransomware, we're shutting most things down. And so we're turning off Active Directory, changing everything. People are locked out of their accounts. We're doing password changes, etc. Really how we use things like Inky is with the clients as we're done with the containment and we're working on the longer term remediation or mitigation. And then we're saying, look, they came in through phishing. Here's what our investigation found. This is a serious gap. Inky, your endpoint security solution, you need to update with the next gen EDR. We put another tool in there. And so we give them options for tools, and it's almost like a POC.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'll put it in there, do the assessment, let them see it themselves. Hey, you're still being attacked. We've done the mitigation, but they're still trying to get in, and other folks are as well. This is going to protect you. This is going to protect you. And it gives them time to really look at the broader hygiene across their enterprise, network segmentation, and putting the VPNs in front of the remote access, using MFA for all elevated accounts. I mean, there's a lot of pieces they can do. And so we try to put a hard and crunchy shell around them with Inky and other tools like that to protect them while they're doing the internal mitigation.
Right. And Dave, this question to you, it's tangential to what Mike just talked about. When Inky is doing this phishing detection, is it doing the phishing detection before or after it hits the user's mailbox? And there's a follow-up on that. How easy is it for the end user to release or say that something is just a false positive?
Yeah, one of the things that we decided at the very beginning of this 5, 6, 7 years ago was we want to be able to block stuff before it gets delivered. So if it's provably malicious, we want to be able to send it to quarantine, like the incumbent systems. You know, it's not a novel thing that we did. We just decided we didn't want to rely purely on the post-delivery API access that you get from Microsoft and Google, because we wanted to be able to send stuff to the quarantine so users don't even interact with it. The other advantage of analyzing the mail before it's delivered is that you can modify the mail as it transits through. And that's what allows us to add 75 different kinds of messages in the form of the email assistant and the banner. That also lets us, by the way, add a link below the banner, report this email. And that's where users can express their belief. Hey, I think this is safe, spam, or phishing. And if it's spam, we even let them block that. You even say, hey, if you don't want this mail, Inky can just stop delivering it to you. So you can, as a user, say, I don't ever want to get mail from this domain anymore. And then in terms of releasing stuff that got sent to quarantine or undelivering mail that got through for whatever reason, that's where we do use those post-delivery APIs provided by Google and Microsoft. We can go in and grab a mail that's been delivered that we want to remove. Admins can do this on a mass level. They can say, I want to find all the mails that have been delivered that have this attachment with this MD5 sum, remove them all, and we let them do a trial to see, here's what you will delete if you run this command. Let's them mass delete stuff. So we use a hybrid deployment method exactly for the reason that we want to do some stuff in real time before the mail's delivered. And then we want to give admins the ability to release things from quarantine. And generally, we don't have a separate quarantine, so the way you release something from quarantine doesn't change. So if we move something to quarantine, it's going to be to the O365 quarantine, and that can either be the admin quarantine where an admin has to release it, or it can be set up so that the user can release it themselves. But there's no different releasing mechanism in Inky for quarantine mail.
Great, great. Mike, another question to you from a guidance to the MSPs that are out there. How can an MSP actively recruit like small to medium-sized organizations, or even, larger projects? And how can a company like Arete bring value to that?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a number of different ways that we've seen the MSPs operate. One is to partner with some of the value-added resellers who may not have their own MSP capability, or a cybersecurity firm like Arete. Our primary funnel is through incident response, and we work with a number of MSPs. We have our own MSP capability, but I think everyone knows right now with the great walkout, it's incredibly difficult to scale up in terms of capability. So one of the ways they can do it is to have partners and really act as part of a team versus trying to go it solo. And we found that the partnering really helps us a lot. We partner with a lot of VARs, a lot of major companies, cloud providers, et cetera, which is driving a lot of our MSP MDR business right now. Some of our technology partners that we have that we were the first incident response firm to adopt SentinelOne, for example. And we get a fair bit of our work from SentinelOne. When our partner gets a request for an MSP, they can funnel it to us, and then we'll get the business for the MSP for that client. And so the partnership route is really the best way I've seen. Another way I've seen MSPs really strike home is to find a niche. And I hate doing that because I just said don't do the buzzwords by Google, but find a niche somewhere, like whether it's medical billing or small dental offices or small CPA firms, and come up with a custom offering for them. Like, hey, you're a small 10-person CPA firm. We have a turnkey solution for you that's going to help protect you and your clients. Tax season is coming. You don't want to deal with this stuff. We're there for you. We'll help you ramp up, ramp down, and tune your offering to those clients, understanding their business needs and requirements.
Wonderful. Dave, kind of like a tangential question, what, in your opinion, makes a good MSP-focused solution?
Oh, that's a great question, because it's not simple. I think a lot of vendors of security solutions assume, well, I'm just going to take my thing I'm selling to enterprises and now sell it to MSPs. It's not at all feasible to do that without investing significant effort into the product. And so among the things that we really focus on, and I think MSPs like about our solution, is we put a lot of effort into our dashboard and reporting tools. So the MSP, on behalf of their stable of customers, can see the situational awareness, both for an individual customer and also across their customers. We've also invested heavily in policy settings, giving the MSP a lot of fine-grained control over how Inky works. And that could be like the kind of thing I mentioned earlier with what should happen to mail that goes to quarantine. Should it go to the admin quarantine, or there's 1,000 knobs, right? And so we have a concept of a tree, essentially. So the MSP can set for themselves, here's my defaults that I want to start out of the box with Inky. And then I can go into one of my sub-customers or even one of their organizational units and change the policy slightly for them. It's almost like object-oriented, object inheritance, or a policy tree that lets them say, well, the defaults apply to everybody unless I override them at a lower level. The other huge thing for us has driven a lot of success with MSP is onboarding. Onboarding has to be completely simple, take 30 seconds and always work and not have to involve us. That is a massive enabler. And we had one MSP say to us recently, why would I ever deploy one of these other solutions where it takes 24 hours for me to deploy it when yours is 30 seconds? That is just a massive enabler for us, is the onboarding we give MSPs the ability to onboard customers for themselves without even talking to us. Obviously, there's a billing thing that happens in the back end, but that's been a really huge one for us too. And I think finally, it's easy to say this, but we care a lot about support. And I think, I was talking to an investor at one point, and they were saying, well, you guys spend a lot of money on customer success. I said, you know who else spends a lot of money on customer success? Amazon. It's kind of working out for them. So I think in the modern era, MSPs and customers of all kinds expect really good support. And if you give it to them and you don't lie to them, you tell them the truth, even when the truth hurts, they stick with you. And they tell their peer companies, hey, these are good guys. You can work with these guys. They'll support you when there's problems. They'll own it when there's an outage or an issue. That's huge. And I think, again, it's easy to say it, but I think most companies still, even in 2022, don't do it because it requires investing real money and effort into doing it right.
And I think I can add to that. I've been on the vendor side for product as well as the MSP side. For me, I think one of the most important things is feeling like you're in a partnership. And so if you need a custom connector or help with the API or something, things that enable you to service your clients better, knowing that, hey, we need this feature set, and having Inky say, you're absolutely right, you're not the first one to ask for that. We're going to put it in our roadmap. Q4, it'll be there. That kind of support, to your point with the investment, is really critical for MSPs, MDR firms, security firms, service providers to know that to make our job easier so we can service the client better and to help our reputation, Inky's got our back. And you're going to be there to help us carry our clients to the next level. I think that's a critical thing as well.
It's actually one of the fascinating things too, that people generally naively view that investing in customer success and having even more, technical people in your company talk to customers directly, that those are just costs, right? That's a burden. And they're actually not, because the truth is a lot of innovation comes from that kind of interaction.
Exactly.
I mean, how are we supposed to know what an important feature is or capability or approach if we're not only talking to the customers, but also having the right people talk to the customers, not just salespeople, but, the developers who, I always say a lot of innovation happens at the keyboard. The developer is looking at some piece of code like, what should I write here? I don't, no one really told me what the requirement is. If that person has had lots of conversations with someone like Mike, well, first of all, they're going to have an intuition of what to do there. And second of all, they can ask Mike, what should I, what do you think? And usually what the customers specifically ask for isn't exactly the right thing for us to implement. But when 20 customers have asked for a range of things around a topic, then that starts to coalesce into something that, yeah, this makes a lot of sense for us to add as a first-class capability. So it's really important. It's not just a burden. It's actually a source of innovation.
100%. I've seen it on both sides of the fence. You're spot on. It drives the innovation in the next gen. I mean, it keeps the technology relevant to the clients.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, gentlemen. And thanks again for a fantastic dialogue, Mike and Dave. And with that, I would like to thank our audience for joining the conversation today. If you would like to learn more about the Inky email security platform, visit us at inky.com. Have a great day, everyone.